I want you to think back to that special night and that special meal that you'll never forget. What made it so special? What about the aromas that take you back in time, like Grandma's cookies or Grandpa's garage? These are flavor memories. But what is flavor and where does it come from? I'm Jeremy Storton. I'm an Advanced Cicerone and the host of the Good Beer Matters podcast. I've partnered with the BrewDB to bring you trusted brew knowledge. Trusted Brew Knowledge is a series of videos to help you better understand beer and what to make of it. In this video series, we're going to take a deep dive into the complex world of beer flavor.
My name's Peter Cronin. I'm the quality manager here at AleSmith Brewing Company.
So let's talk about the not the last ingredient that beer could have, but the last of the four main ingredients.
Sure.
Let's talk about yeast. The flavors that the yeast produce are, it's almost like they have their own terroir. I mean, to me, that's where the easiest way to put terroir in your beer is to use different yeast.
Yeah.
Just from a basic, simple level, what flavors do we hope to get from yeast before we talk about the ones that we hope not to get from yeast?
So yeast so they're creating this carbon dioxide and the alcohol. Those are their main two byproducts, or main two products of fermentation. But they're also creating a bunch of byproducts. Yeast is creating a lot of other alcohols other than the ethanol that we want beer to have. They're also creating a lot of acids as well. That's what makes beer acidic and very, very stable.
But the flavors that come out of yeast, you know, we have like the fruity estery flavors. We have like the peppery, smoky without being smoky, phenolic flavors.
Yeah.
And then there's a difference between ale yeast and lager yeast.
Right.
Right. Will you talk about those differences and how they manifest in creating different flavors in beer?
Sure. Well, one is very easy, is that phenolic flavor. It's really tied to a gene. So they can go to the DNA of the yeast and say, this is going to produce that phenolic off flavor or isn't. Other ones, we still don't have the gene tied to the flavor. So that's all science that's happening right now. But a lager and ale strain, they split off way long ago, a few hundred years ago. One, you'll probably hear this a lot of top fermenting and bottom fermenting. And then ale yeast tends to krausen on the top a lot more. Krausen is just the foam that happens during fermentation. A mixture of protein and yeast, and they're all having fun up there. Lager yeast, because it tends to be fermented cooler, will kind of just stay in the beer, won't create too much of that krausen, that foam on top. Ale yeast, if you put it in a 50-degree fermentation, it's not going to do anything. They don't like those temperatures. They're going to go to sleep and hang out at the bottom and do nothing. Whereas lagers don't care. They'll keep fermenting, and because you're kind of keeping them in this cool environment, they're not going to create a lot of off flavors. That's why lagers tend to be the lawnmower beers. They tend to be just like clean, crisp. You want to go back for another sip. Very, very simple and soft. Whereas ales tend to have a bigger punch. They're partying a little hotter. And creating a lot more fruity esters and all that stuff.
I always think about, when I explain the difference between ale yeast and lager yeast, I always think about with ale yeast, they're the ones that having just like the raging pool party. They like it warmer.
Definitely.
They've got their arm floaties on, so they're hanging out the surface. And it's just like all guns blazing. We're having a good old time. We're eating things like crazy, and we're gonna, kick out, whatever we want.
Right.
But the lager yeast, they're the ones that like it a little bit colder. They're going to cuddle up a little bit more. They're having, like a quiet discussion at a book club type of thing, and everything is nice and neat and organized, and there's not much debris coming off there, right? And so you have flavor profiles like the lager yeast tend to be a little bit more staid or clean in their profile, but you can still get, like you mentioned, a Czech style lager or like a Bohemian Pilsner or Bo Pils. They tend to have a little bit more body. They tend to have a little bit more diacetyl, kicking out that buttery flavor. And I think a lot of that has to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of that has to do with the behavior of these little organisms, right?
And they're taking up different proteins and they're creating different esters. They'll create acids and alcohols in different quantities. And those will come back together and create different esters. German lager yeast, and I get this a lot from even very well-known German lagers is that isoamyl acetate, that banana flavor that you usually get in German ales, like a Hefeweizen or Weissbier. I still get that in tiny little quantities in German lagers. I must be super sensitive to it. But I'm sure at some point the Hefeweizen yeast kind of mated with them a little bit and crossed over.
Maybe, yeah. I get a little touch of that in whenever I have a Coors Light. I'm like, it's like there's a little bit of banana in there.
Exactly.
But that's where it's interesting to see the difference between lagers and especially you brought up the German Weissbiers, where just big bold flavors of banana and clove, and that's just the behavior and the chemistry of the yeast that they love banana bread and something to drink with it.
Exactly.
Right. So we've talked about the 4 main ingredients that go into beer, but of course there are other ingredients that go into beer. It could span from adjunct grains that are malted or not malted. There could be fruit, there could be vegetables, there could be barrels. There's a lot of different things that can end up in our beer to add flavor. And far too many to talk about all of them. What are some that you have experienced and really enjoyed or have been interesting? Or maybe giving you a challenge as the QC guy for AleSmith?
Certainly our barrel aging program. We have, at one point we had over 600 barrels in-house. And that ranges from, most of them are bourbon, but it ranges from red wine and white wine. We've had gin barrels. We contact a lot of the local distilleries, so we have their rum. San Diego's pretty well known for its rum distilleries. And just adding that flavor in, certainly you'll get the spirit flavor, but the barrel has a lot more in the oak of the barrel to add in. So I teach at the UCSD Brewing School, the barrel aging course, and we go over the lactones that are added in. That's the coconut, and sometimes that could be like peachy or apricot-y from the barrel. Whenever you taste a whiskey or a bourbon barrel aged beer and you get that vanilla note, and there's been no vanilla has been added, you get vanillin. It's the same exact molecule from oak, from American white oak, that gets into the beer that vanilla would be adding in.
Okay.
It's very, very cool. And same with lactones. It's the same exact molecule. That's why your brain is saying, hey, there's coconut in this. There isn't, but the lactone from the oak is getting in, and that's the same exact molecule.
And whether we're talking about barrels or compounds or fruit or different grains, just the sheer fact that I think about if we had 4 chords to write 1,000 songs, we could do it.
Yeah.
But here in beer, we have 4 ingredients and another 100 ingredients to make 1,000 beers, and they're all going to be different, and they're all going to have, even with the same grist bill, the same recipe, you're going to have different nuances and different flavors coming out of that just because of the differences of ingredients.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the thing I find just fascinating.
From brewery to brewery, everything's different, and it makes it awesome. You can just hop around this San Diego, this is Miramar, now called Beeramar, because there's a brewery on every block. And you could ride your bike and just go from brewery to brewery, and every IPA, every Pilsner is going to taste a little different because the process, the ingredients, where they get their malt from, what yeast they're using, it's all going to be a little different. And that's what's great is everyone has different taste buds, and people are going to find what beer is right for them.